The air tasted of iron and dust long before the first arrow fell. On the 4th of July, 1187, the plateau of Hattin baked under a Levantine sun that left no shadow, and a man named Guy de Lusignan watched his kingdom slide into a bottle from which there would be no escape. He did not lose Jerusalem in battle, though battle is where history places the crime. He lost it long before in a series of choices that seemed ordinary at the time, in the loyalty he gave to the wrong man and the advice he refused from the right one. What if the man history blames was never the real problem? If you've ever trusted someone because they were loyal, even when their judgment failed, you already know the opening note of this story. Guy was not a coward. He was not a traitor. He was a king who inherited a fracture that had already split the kingdom's spine. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, by 1186, was a marvel of survival. For 87 years, it had held the coast of the Levant against forces that outnumbered it 10-1 through a system of castles, truces, and a succession of rulers who understood that survival meant flexibility. Then a leper king died without an heir, and the high court made a choice. They gave the crown to Guy because he was married to Sibylla, the dead king's sister, and because he was a capable knight. What the chronicles do not say is that the high court was deeply divided. Some barons refused to attend the coronation. Raymond of Tripoli, the most powerful lord in the kingdom, rode north to his own castle and sealed its gates. That fracture is the forgotten principle. The kingdom did not fall because Guy was incompetent. It fell because the political architecture of the Crusader states had already been hollowed out by a succession crisis, by personal rivalries, and by a treaty with Saladin that everyone was pretending still held. The cracks ran through the stone before Guy ever sat on the throne. You have just touched the skeleton of a collapse that predates any battle. If you want to recognize that same skeleton the next time a public figure is blamed for a disaster that was already in motion, subscribe to this channel, because we keep digging past the surface into the forgotten joints of history. And tell me in the comments, what single word would you use to describe the real cause here? Fracture, succession, or something else you see in the stone before Guy? Now consider this. In the spring of 1187, Raymond of Tripoli made a secret truce with Saladin. He allowed Saladin's troops to pass through his lands to raid the territory of Guy's own supporters, a direct violation of his oath as a vassal. When Guy heard, he had two choices: attack Raymond, which would tear the kingdom apart, or negotiate. He chose to negotiate. He marched an army north to Tiberias, Raymond's city, and opened talks. The chroniclers call this hesitation, but what was he supposed to do? Burn the kingdom from within. Guy's error was not indecision. It was that he trusted Raymond's word when Raymond promised to return to the fold. Here is where the escalation begins. On the 1st of May, 1187, a Frankish embassy returning from the negotiations was ambushed at the springs of Crusades. The Hospitaller Grand Master and most of his knights were killed, their bodies left in the sun. The surviving eyewitness described the smell of blood mixing with irrigation water that day. When the news reached Guy at Jerusalem, he called his army. He had no choice. The kingdom's honor demanded response, and the military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, pushed for immediate march. But here is the detail most histories skip. The army could not march for weeks because Guy's treasury was empty after years of succession costs. He had to sell church plate to pay the soldiers. By the time the army assembled at Acre in late June, the summer heat had already baked the springs dry. Guy knew this. His scouts had reported that the water sources between Acre and Tiberias were unreliable. But the Templar Grand Master, Gerard de Rochefort, insisted that Saladin was weak, that this was the moment to strike, that delay would look like fear. Gerard de Rochefort was the wrong advisor, And Guy listened to him because Gerard had been loyal during the succession crisis, because Gerard had supported his claim when others abandoned him. That is the trap. Loyalty and good judgment are not the same thing, but in a king's mind, they blur. On the 2nd of July, Guy's army camped at the springs of Sephoria, a reliable water source. Raymond of Tripoli, now supposedly reconciled, argued that they should wait. "Let Saladin come to them," he said. "Fight on ground of your choosing, with water at your back." The army had enough supplies for a month. There was no military reason to move. Then, on the night of the 2nd of July, a messenger arrived from Tiberias. Saladin had besieged the city. Raymond's own wife, Eschiva, was trapped inside the citadel with her children. Raymond stood before the war council and said quietly, "I cannot advise my liege lord to attack because of my own interests." He walked away. But Gerard de Riedfort did not walk away. He turned to Guy and said, "Lord King, the Count of Tripoli is a traitor. He does not want you to fight because he is in league with Saladin. If you do not march, you will lose the kingdom's honor forever." Guy made his decision at dawn on the 3rd of July. He ordered the army to march east toward Tiberias, across a waterless plateau in the heat of July. The true cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, was carried at the head of the column. It took 7 men to lift the cart that carried it, and by midday, the wheels were sinking into dust. You are watching the exact moment a good man trusts the wrong voice. Gerard's loyalty bought a fatal ear. If you want to study that same psychological pattern in other collapses, from empires to boardrooms, subscribe to this channel, because we trace the hidden wiring of decisions that seem like military history, but are really about human trust. And in the comments, put the name of one advisor, Raymond or Gerard, whose counsel you think Guy should have followed, and why. The army marched for 12 hours. Men collapsed from thirst. Horses died in harness. By late afternoon, Saladin's skirmishers had encircled the column, cutting them off from the springs they had passed. Guy had no choice but to order a night camp on a dry ridge, without water, with the enemy closing in. Imagine the sound, the rasp of thousands of men breathing dry air, the lowing of dying cattle, the distant horns of Saladin's army settling into position like wolves around a kill. The fires of the Muslim camp ringed the ridge in a circle of light. No one slept. At dawn on the 4th of July, Saladin set fire to the dry grass. The wind carried smoke into the Crusader lines. Thirst and smoke, together, broke the cavalry before a single charge was made. When the knights finally dismounted and fought on foot, they could barely lift their swords. Raymond of Tripoli led a charge that broke through the enemy lines, and he kept riding. He escaped with his men. The chronicles say he charged because the situation was hopeless. Guy fought on foot until his horse was killed beneath him, then until his sword broke, then until his men were cut down around him. He did not flee. By noon, the true cross had been captured. By mid-afternoon, Guy was a prisoner. The army that had marched out of Acre with nearly 20,000 men had ceased to exist. In a single day, Jerusalem lost its field army, its relic, and its king. When Saladin met Guy in his tent, he offered him a cup of water. Guy drank, then passed the cup to a fellow prisoner. Saladin turned to his interpreter and said, "Tell the king that he just gave water to a man I will execute at dawn." Guy had, without knowing it, extended mercy to a man Saladin had already condemned. This small act stayed the execution for that night. But the metal of the story is this. Guy was released a year later, and he immediately tried to reclaim his throne. He never lost a battle before Hattin. He never lost a battle after Hattin. He lost one single battle in his entire career, and it was the one that destroyed a kingdom. That is not a pattern of incompetence. That is a pattern of systemic failure. The siege of Jerusalem began in September 1187. The city had no army to defend it. After 13 days, Balian of Ibelin negotiated a surrender that allowed the inhabitants to buy their freedom. Those who could not pay were sold into slavery. The kingdom that had stood for almost 90 years was gone. When you read the old chronicles, they call Guy the Fool the weak king, the man who lost the Holy Land. But the evidence says something different. He was a king who trusted the wrong advisor because that advisor had been loyal to him when it mattered. He was a man who made a decision in a crisis, under pressure, with bad information. He was human. Here is what that means for you. The next time you see a collapse, a company, a relationship, a career, the story is rarely about the visible moment of failure. The real fracture happened months or years before, in a succession of ordinary choices, in loyalty given to the wrong person, in advice taken because it came from a friend. The battle is just the last paragraph. You have just seen the cleanest X-ray of that skeleton, the structural weakness, the sudden crisis, the good person trusting the wrong voice. If you want to keep recognizing this pattern in the world around you, subscribe to this channel, because we spend every video extracting the invisible architecture of collapse. And before you go, drop a comment with one modern example you have witnessed, a company, a leader, or even a personal moment where the visible failure was only the last paragraph of a much older fracture. This is the part that stays with me. Guy's name is remembered as a curse, but when archaeologists excavate the ruins of the castles he built, they find mortar that still holds after 8 centuries. He was a builder, not a destroyer. He simply inherited a wall that was already cracked, and he happened to be standing on it when the earthquake came. Before you go, hold that image. A man who built solid walls, who trusted his friends, who fought until his sword broke and did not run. He made one wrong decision under impossible pressure. Maybe the story is not about him. Maybe the story is about a kingdom that gave its only crown to a good man and pretended that was enough. If you have ever made a call you knew was risky because the person who urged it had never let you down before, you already know Guy's exact weight. The difference is that your mistake might cost a job, a friendship, or a month of sleep. His cost a kingdom, a relic, and the freedom of 10,000 souls. The forgotten principle is not about Hattin. It is about the shape of failure itself. Every collapse shares a skeleton, a long-running structural weakness, a sudden crisis, and a decision made by a good person who trusted the wrong voice in the room. The fall of Jerusalem is one of history's cleanest X-rays of that skeleton. Now the air has gone still. The sun has set on the plateau where the true cross was carried away. In the great mosque of Damascus, that broken piece of wood was locked in a chest and forgotten by nearly everyone. But the shape of the choice that lost it is not forgotten. It repeats. Guy de Lusignan died in exile in Cyprus in 1194. He spent his last years building a new kingdom on an island he had never wanted. The castles he raised there still stand, and when you walk through the ruins of Kyrenia and see the thickness of those walls, you see a man who learned, too late, that the best armor cannot protect a king from the person he chooses to believe.